Hello, I'm Claudia Chwalisz, CEO and founder of DemocracyNext. Welcome to another Democratic Future is Possible, Democracy Next podcast. On it, we interview the world's leading figures who are at the cutting edge of innovating democratic practices and institutions in ways that broaden who has power and improve how we take collective decisions together. In other words, we put a spotlight on the people who are showing the world that another democratic future is possible and that we can build it together. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Hélène Landemore, who is a friend and one of the world's leading thinkers about democracy. She is the author of numerous influential books, her latest one being Politics Without Politicians, The Case for Citizen Rule, and the one before that is Open Democracy. Hélène served on the governance committee of the French Citizens' Assembly on End of Life, and she observed the French Climate Assembly. She is also one of DemocracyNext's founding advisors, and she continues to be a source of inspiration for our work. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I've been looking forward to having the chance to interview you, and the timing is very apt. I got back from Athens yesterday, where I had the chance to visit various ancient sites of democracy and was discussing related ideas at the World Beautiful Business Forum. So I'm curious to dive deeper with you on where your thinking is at today. In your latest book, you make the argument that democracy isn't broken. We've just been doing it wrong. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, thank you, Claudia. I want to say it's always an absolute pleasure to talk to you. So my latest book, I do make the case that it's not broken. We've just grown disillusioned with a very poorly conceived version of it. That's kind of like the conclusion I've reached after kind of resisting it, frankly, for a decade or more. But I think that's to me now an unavoidable conclusion. We think we reinvented democracy in the 18th century, but we did not. I think we invented a form of legitimate, oligarchy based on popular consent, but in which power is not truly shared equally. It's concentrated at the top, of the income distribution, among educated people with connections and a certain type of psychological predisposition to want to rule, etc. So if we truly meant to empower everyone equally, we would do democracy differently. And I think that the normative ideal is as appealing as ever. People are eager for a voice, eager for a say. And I think they want more than just the option to vote for, power-hungry people every few years. There's something else that's possible, available, and we just have to have the courage to embrace that path.
Well, it's interesting that you say you've been resisting that for the past few years while you've been working on this as well. And I'm also wondering, because I have found also depending on the audience, and sometimes I veer from being more or less radical, but actually when I was at this conference and I was in Athens, I was like, well, actually, is it that radical to quote Aristotle, who said that elections are a form of oligarchy? It's just most people are not familiar with that. And we're kind of looking for democracy in our oligarchic institutions and are like, why isn't this working?
Well, I think the sort of conflict, I suppose, even in you and me, is that we don't want to look like we're siding with the populists. We don't want to look like we want to overthrow a regime that, after all, has done quite a lot of good in comparison to, despotic forms of rule or truly aristocratic forms of rule where there's no turnover and the concentration of power is even worse. But at the same time, if we keep saying we already live in a democracy, what's the margin for improvement? It's just minimal, right? Like, well, let's do better with elections. Let's take the money out of politics. But we're never going to confront the fact that the way we select representatives and some leaders really means disempowering 90% of the population, because 90% of the population is not capable of winning elections. So the fact that we chose that mechanism, that selection mechanism, over the obvious other one, which is random selection, means we're okay with concentrating power among the top 10% of the population, income-wise and education-wise and all that. So are we willing to face up to that truth, which is that everyone should be able to rule and be ruled in turn? Everyone should have a turn at representing others. everyone should have power in their hands once in their life, right? Or at least have the possibility of it, in the current system, I don't think we have that. And it's just hard to accept it because from birth, from an early age, we're told you already live in a democracy. So there's an element of ideology that is beaten into us, and it's
Yeah.
really hard to escape. So even I still struggle a little bit. So, there's a question of, okay, who's your audience? Do we want to alienate that audience? Because if they think you're questioning, even like if you're questioning voting rights, it's already like not the right understanding of what we're trying to do. But questioning elections should not be seen as necessarily populist. It's just a real question about the meaning of democracy, how we institutionalize it, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm. Yeah, no, definitely. I see what you mean. And I think, well, I'm curious how you have a sense of also, given you've been doing this work for a very long time now too, if you've noticed any difference in terms of how people react to some of the more radical propositions, the idea of sortition, so randomly selecting decision makers. Like I feel like I've noticed actually a shift of people almost being more open to the more radical arguments and like questioning like is this really changing something to have these one-off assemblies that they don't always actually have any real power or there's a big fight for that power to even have any influence and like how are we actually going to start changing something in a more fundamental way? So how does that like yeah, what are the kind of reactions that you tend to get to
Well,
this, or
so
does it really depend?
I would say for years the reaction was, "Oh, this is utopian, this is unfeasible," and to the extent that it's feasible, it can only be advisory. Um,
Mm,
and some reactions were quite violent. I mean, in my book, I mentioned, the example of the president of the National Assembly who
mm,
came to speak to the, members of our convention on end of life. And she lost it, basically. She was like, when a citizen raised their hands and said, well, how come we have less power than the first French Citizens Assembly on climate? She said, it's out of the question that randomly selected people replace elected officials. You are, representative of the diversity of the country, but you are not representatives and you have no legitimacy to decide. I mean, really, really upset about the challenge to the legitimacy of elected officials, basically. I saw that
mm,
in Chile as well, people who are afraid of empowering the riffraff, basically, conservatives who think that the people are just too uneducated and incapable.
Plato's argument lives on in modern ways.
Yes, but that said, I also find that the more we do these assemblies, the more you realize that indeed, as long as they'll be purely advisory, they will be too sleth, right? And they will be
Mm,
prone to capture, and they will be prone to, uh, participation washing, as we call it, right? Like the creating the illusion of empowering people, but not really giving them any actual control over anything. So
mm,
I think there's a bit more of a realization that we should go further, which creates all kinds of problems because if you go further, like okay, you run into the reaction of elected officials, you run into constitutional barriers, and the reality is that we need to legitimize these things and institutionalize them to give them power, and
mm, mhm,
that's a huge step that at the same time I would say that even for me, it took me a while to realize that we've kind of done it already in a way. So if you
mm,
look at the climate convention in France, the first one we ever did, this was actually the most ambitious. And I have a paper coming out with my co-author Théophile Pénigaud this week actually, where we talk about the fact that this assembly was actually a de facto group of citizen legislators. Because what
mhm,
happened is that in a sort of hubristic move, President Macron outsourced the legislative initiative of the office of the prime minister to that assembly. And and he promised them
mm,
that he would take the recommendations directly to regulation, a referendum, or a parliamentary vote. And I think this was actually very radical. I don't think we quite understood it at the time. Although now looking
mm,
back, I think people understood it because even the members of the organizers of the Second French Assembly said in private conversations, "We're not going to write the law this time. We tried last time, and it was a disaster because from their perspective, it didn't work out." But so it's interesting to me
right.
that
Okay.
even recognizing the fact that the Constitution doesn't recognize the power of a citizens' assembly to legislate, that's kind of what happened anyway. And then there's another example from the US, actually. It's not quite a citizens' assembly, but it's this Michigan Commission on Redistricting, the Michigan Redistricting Commission, it's called.
Okay.
In 2021, in order to fight gerrymandering, there was a social movement that managed to change the state constitution to put the drawing of the electoral maps into the hands of a newly created body, this Michigan Redistricting Commission, that would be selected at random to put in power 15 ordinary voters, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, 5 independents. So it was, sorry, it's like 13, not 15. And they were the ones who legislated the new maps, the new electoral maps. So we say, oh, it's impossible, etc., but we are actually already doing it, whether, by circumventing the Constitution or by changing the Constitution in the case of the US. So I feel like this idea that citizens' assembly cannot be binding is less prevalent, but not much, but a little less. And we're already doing things that prove that it can be done, that they can be binding.
Yeah, but do you feel like that French Assembly on Climate actually was binding though? Because I think, well, there have been various analyses, a lot of criticisms. I think a lot of the criticisms were actually overblown because the knowledge, what's it called? KNOCA, the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, also published a paper not that long ago, which looked in depth, kind of recommendation by recommendation, a number of years on to see, and actually quite a lot, the vast majority in some way or form, did make their way into legislation, despite some of the popular narrative that a lot of it, went behind.
Yeah.
But it wasn't but it wasn't quite binding either. So,
No,
I don't know. So I
because
don't know. I'm curious to read the new paper that you're talking about as well.
but sometimes so it's tricky because I think what I'm trying to say is that it was meant to be like the initiative power of the prime minister, which is not the final say, but it's putting things on the agenda. In
Right.
that sense,
Okay.
that like this initiative power, that what does it mean for that to be binding? Well, it means that at least they get to deliberate and put it on the agenda, etc. Now, downstream, the final say was still in the hands of existing institutions, including parliament, including ministries, etc. But I also feel like, to a degree, this was a little contingent that it didn't work out better because there was a mechanism that could have helped the assembly almost get to this point of being binding, which was the referendum. Because Macron had
Okay.
said,
Yeah.
I'll send you recommendations to a referendum. But sadly, the citizens themselves in that assembly debated and chose not to go to a referendum. So I feel like it could have gone much further. The fact that they chose to trust the system and parliament in particular, you could say was their mistake, right? Like they just had
Right.
faith in the system still. And in a way, it's worse than that, actually. Sadly, it's not that they had too much trust in the system. They also had not enough trust in their peers. So I think at one point they got convinced that, we've been in this assembly for like several months. We've talked to experts. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this. People outside have no idea. They're going to vote against it. If we go to a referendum, we're going to lose. And why did they think that?
But are they not wrong though in some ways though? Because like that is part of, in my mind, the weakness of using the referendum as a mechanism. And I think this is maybe one of the few things we disagree on
We
in terms of
disagree on
your
that, yeah.
proposals on the referendum, because precisely like these people have spent a huge amount of time thinking in depth and have considered and weighed the arguments and figured out the common ground. And then it goes out to people who they're being asked their top of mind opinion on this. Of course, it's different in the sense that people in this case would have known that those recommendations are coming from the Citizens' Assembly, not from a politician or top down or from government. So I think that might have actually had an influence because at least the polling showed that on the Climate Assembly in particular, the French population wanted those recommendations to be binding. So I think like the fellow citizens actually trusted the Citizens' Assembly, and that would have helped get it over. But I think on the point about people's knowledge and understanding of the complexity of an issue, I think the citizens in the assembly were not necessarily
Well, but it doesn't
entirely
mean
wrong.
no, but it doesn't mean that the people outside the assembly are so far apart. If you look at the climate convention, for example, there were polls that showed that 13 at the 14 structuring proposals that came out of the convention were embraced by a majority. I was floored when I saw that. And in fact, I wish that we had given those results to the convention to say, you know what, you have this misconception that people outside the assembly will not support you. Look at this. There's only one recommendation that they reject, which was to reduce the speed limit on highways. That's the only one that was rejected, and that's the one that had the least support within the assembly. All the others,
Right.
including the very coercive recommendation to make retrofitting your house or apartment mandatory by a certain date under penalty of not being able to rent it or sell it, those went through as well. It was like quite a high percentage of support. So I actually think that was a mistake. I think they got misled by what they read on social media, because social media is not representative of the silent majority out there. So all they read were people on the extreme left or the extreme right saying, this is a joke, these are green ayatollahs. That's right-wing trolls. And then on the other side, this is a ploy by Macron. They're going to push a carbon tax, and just let's reject this farce and everything. So to me, that was a big missed opportunity. And the idea that referenda would not necessarily, like people, outside the assembly would not necessarily get it. I don't know. If you look at we don't have enough data points, but the referendum on abortion and marriage equality in Ireland, it looks as if, in fact, their preferences kind of tracked the preferences of the larger assembly. So I could see, you know what, we're doing this assembly in Connecticut on property taxes. That's an example where I'm curious to see whether there won't be a much bigger gap between the participants in our assembly and the larger public. Because in the case of abortion, end of life, marriage equality, even climate to a degree, I think the public had evolved. They were ready to embrace a certain change of morals, a certain set of... So maybe the discrepancy was less. But in our case, on property taxes, it's really tricky because in order for change to happen, I think people need to have solidarity across town lines, for example. They need to be ready to maybe share tax revenue across towns so that there's not so many inequalities between children who go to one town with a crappy school and people who go to another town with a great school. And that solidarity, you build it in the assembly. You don't necessarily build it, you cannot make it appear out of thin air outside. So it's possible, we'll see. Let's assume that some solidarity emerges in our assembly and they recommend, I have no idea, it's just a speculation, they might not, but it's not completely baseless because in 2002, Jim Fishkin did a deliberative poll in the Greater New Haven area, and that's what happened. Before the deliberation, 80% of the participants were against sharing incremental tax revenue across town lines. After deliberation, only 40% were against. So you went from a majority against to a majority in favor. If that happens, then I could see all of a sudden this big gap between an assembly of people who've become solidary with each other and see the point of sharing, and then the rest of the public who's still like, well, no, local control all the way. We're not sharing anything.
But I wonder how you're planning to do it too. Well, we'll come in a second to talking about the Connecticut Assembly so that there's more context for people. But I wonder how you'll do it in terms of asking, though, the wider public who is not part of the Assembly, because other polling that has been done of the wider public after an assembly has taken place, if there's a kind of addition explaining like, this is a recommendation that has come from the Citizens Assembly, like, what do you think about this? Like, that has had a positive impact on way more people being willing to support that than if they only get asked about the issue itself.
I think that's right. I think there is a sort of trust that I think it seems like a lot of people are willing to put some trust in this kind of designs. Not everyone, to be honest, but in the French case, a year after the first convention, I think it was like 3 out of 5 French people who knew about it were willing to consider this assembly legitimate to make proposals on behalf of the rest of the group. So I think there's some sort of difference to the recommendation that might happen. In our case, we
Well,
will
and
not
also
just
trust
count
in
on
their
that.
fellow citizens.
Yeah. The concept of peer, epistemic peers and citizens like us, etc. But in our case, I don't think we're going to just count on that alone. There's not enough awareness about what citizens' assemblies are in the US still. I mean, we talked to journalists, and one of them wrote an article saying we were doing a big survey. So if journalists cannot get it after listening
Right.
to a full hour-long press conference, I worry about the rest of the state. So we are counting on something else. What we're going to do is try to create a connection between the micro public and the macro public through local deliberations that are self-organized, and that we're going to try to subsidize a little bit by offering ice cream. We have a partner, Ben and Jerry,
Okay.
who's offered to sponsor us that way. So
Ah, great.
because what
I think that's probably through Matt Abrams, our board member, who's helped orchestrate
exactly,
that in
that
some
is right.
way.
That is through him.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
I think we are just trying to solve that problem that has plagued all citizens' assemblies so far, which is like, yeah, how do you connect the people in the room and the people outside the room? And in our case, I told you offline before, but we really reached out to a lot of people to try to recruit participants. So we sent out 240,000 mails to the entire Connecticut
That's a
residents,
lot.
which is a lot. So 10% of the population basically has heard of our assembly if they've read
Amazing.
the mail. So that means we got a lot of mail that went to the state comptroller who's endorsing our assembly saying, hey, because they've heard of people getting the letter and said, hey, I didn't get a letter. I want to get a letter. How do I get one? How do I join? And he had
Okay.
to say, well, sorry, you can't. Like it's
Hmm.
randomness. You just don't get to choose like that. So we feel like
Okay.
we owe these people a chance to participate in something else that would happen in parallel, or maybe after the halfway point when some recommendations come out of our assembly and they're given a chance to deliberate and give feedback to our assembly.
Okay.
That's a hope. And so it's
And
again to answer your question, like assuming there was a referendum, there won't be in our case, but assuming there was a referendum down the line, how do you make sure there's not this wide gulf between the conclusion that the people who had time to deliberate have reached and the larger public?
yeah, I guess so. Well, I guess also it depends on what's the referendum on at the end too, because in these assemblies, as you well know, like there's a large number of recommendations that are each detailed and have their own nuance and
Yeah.
explanations. So is it on the whole package of those recommendations, or are you doing a vote on each one of those one by one? So I think there's like, I mean, in the Ireland example, it's a little bit different
Yeah,
too, because
because
it
it
was
was a
in
yes or
relation
no.
to changing the constitution and yes or no, and it was also legally required to even go down that route in that context, which makes sense for constitutional change as well. But I think it's a little bit more complicated on these nuanced questions that are not yes or no questions as well. But yeah, but anyways, I also had a thought because you mentioned you're going to do these like self-organizing assemblies and that in some way that will feed in. So are you using technology in any cool ways to be able to do that? Like any of these tools like DemBrain or Cortico, where those conversations are being recorded and you can use LLMs to do like synthesis or anything from all of that conversation data?
So we're trying to do something cool, I think. So we're going to try upstream of the assembly. We're going to use the tools of our partner make.org to reach out to a large number of Connecticut residents through targeted ads, through social media, through there are like multiple ways they reach out to people. We have a budget for that, which is quite substantial. And then there are multiplicity of questions they're being asked. They can ask their own questions about property taxes and how to fund local public services. And we hope to map out, uh, you know, the vision that most Connecticut residents, I mean, or, the question is, will it be a representative sample? I would try to get the demographics to be sure it is, but it might not be. But at least we'll get a sense of, okay, what are some of the views out there? The sense of injustice, the sense of inefficiency. In fact, from the early feedback we're getting, it's mostly the inefficiency, the feeling that your taxes go to stuff that's not really like worth the money somehow. Um,
Hmm.
So that's one aspect of the process upstream. There's a big question as to whether we should give that input directly on day one to the participants in our assembly, or whether we should wait until they've kind of made up their minds a little bit to inject that additional input so that we don't prime them and bias
Mm.
them, especially if the feedback is not actually fully representative demographically.
Mm.
And then midway, we're hoping to present the early recommendation that will form inside the assembly to the larger public, this
Mhm.
time to a truly representative sample, a bit narrower, but more representative, to get a sense of, okay, what are people reacting to? What do they like? What they don't like? Give that feedback back to the assembly so they can tweak or not. And then that way we hope to maximize the chance of uptake down the line.
Okay. Yeah, well, so because in terms of the uptake, then, what's the political backing for this initiative?
So the political backing right now is essentially that of State Comptroller Sean Scanlon, who is one of our partners, together with the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities and the University of Connecticut. And he promised us to get us a legislative hearing
Mhm.
in December. Additionally, he didn't pre-commit to any of the outcomes because he's a cautious politician and it's a little early in the US to, I guess, make this kind of pre-commitment. But I think his intention, from what he said, is to use the output of this citizens' assembly to inform his own policy platform when he runs for governor in the fall.
Okay, interesting. Well, and so I guess just kind of thinking about what we were talking about at the start of this conversation, also the arguments in your book about like here we are in our elected oligarchy, one could say, dysfunctioning democracy, others might say, and we're trying to change things with citizens' assemblies, and there's an attempt to get political buy-in. It's maybe loose or tenuous, if I can say, as from a distance, if I'm listening to this. And
Yeah.
yet you're making these arguments, but you're involved. So clearly you think this is worth your time and this is worth also some step maybe on that path. So like how do you see this being is this a stepping stone for you towards something that could evolve? And like how do you see that happening?
Yes, I think it's a stepping stone because I don't think it's crazy to think you need to have multiple proofs of concepts before you institutionalize something. And the US is so far behind the deliberative wave that I think we need to do some demonstration first. Second, I've read the bill that a Vermont legislator is going to try to pass in Vermont to institutionalize the Citizens Assembly. It's very exciting, but the bill itself, you can tell, it's brand new to these people. Like the size of the assembly, the way it's selected, like it's too crude in my view. So, and I think they know
Mm,
that. They know that anyway, it's going to take years for a bill like that to pass, right? It's going to be rejected over and over again, but it's for the better because you need to polish your proposal.
mm,
And I also think that as much as I'm very proud of what the French have done and full of admiration for what the Irish have done and what the Belgian have done, I don't think we've fully nailed the format of these assemblies. And for me, one big unknown is still the governance of assemblies, which to me is still
mm,
too technocratic, too expert driven. So
mm,
one big novelty we're introducing in the Connecticut Assembly, which is why, in a way, even if it doesn't end up having too much of an impact, I still think it's very important to run it because we learn something from it. We're
mhm.
trying to introduce citizen governance, like full citizen governance. So
Okay.
people like me are members of the governance committee until July 11th. On July 11th, the 17 of us, we surrender our voting rights entirely. And from
Okay.
then on, it's up to the citizens to make the remaining decisions. So it's not to
Okay.
say that, we're giving them this big Ferrari and they can just drive it into a wall. There will be some guardrails. Like we've already kind of set up the number of meetings. There's anyway a huge budget constraint, so they cannot just do anything they want. And I'm sure they'll see it themselves. So
Mm,
it's not like, there are some sort of constitutional guardrails if you want. But if they want to change the slate of experts we've planned for them, they can. If they want to
mm,
add a purely online virtual meeting, they can. because those are much less costly, and so we might have some money left. Or
Mm.
they can decide that they're not going to do a classic set of recommendation, but do something else entirely. Like we really want to take the chance, a risk,
Okay.
to see if they can self-govern. I fundamentally believe they can. I also fundamentally believe that we're not going to be credible as promoters of
Mm.
these democratic innovations unless we go all the way. We run fully with the idea of citizen competence, right? And as long as we keep them down and just we constrain their agenda, we constrain the
Mm.
decision about the procedures, we're not going all the way. So that's the idea.
Okay, super interesting indeed. I have not heard of that being the case. And there'll be 17 of them as well, and they're randomly selected as part of the same sortition process,
That,
but for the
we
governance
haven't,
committee.
I would love to hear your feedback on that actually. I'm not sure how
Okay.
to do it. I think for because we're under such time pressure and budget constraints,
Mm.
I think we'll have to do some kind of representative structure where my idea right now, but we haven't even discussed it
Mm.
yet with the facilitators and the other members of the governance committee, is that we will offer them a range of options, maybe two or three. But I think the one I would recommend personally is to go for a group of 12, like, 12 angry men, the same concept of a jury, that are plucked
Okay.
at random from the 100 and that meet with us because we're not disappearing. We're still there as a support system that meet
Yeah.
with us after each meeting, after each weekend to make decisions relative to the next weekend. And we will
Okay.
save them a lot of time. Like we don't want to burden them too much either. Like, it's a lot of work. So we just
Mm.
give them, they give us 2 extra hours of their time and we say, okay, here are the things that need to be decided. If you have other
Mm.
ideas, please go ahead. But like at the
Okay.
minimum, these are the decisions. And
Okay.
here are the pros, here are the cons, here are the options. You have expert one, expert two, expert three. Do you want them all at once? Do you want them in succession?
Mm.
What do you want to do with your time next weekend, right? So it's very demanding because it means we have to adjust as we go, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, that's what you do when you're an expert committee anyway. But there's less visibility, if you want, than when it's
Mm.
under the control of people like us.
Okay, well, I think that's super cool, and we need more of that. The only kind of similar thing that I'm aware of is in the collaboration that we're doing with Arantzazu Lab, which is a democratic innovation lab in
Yeah.
the Basque Country, and Mondragon, which is one of the world's biggest and oldest cooperatives, doing a first pilot at Mondragon University, which will take place with a mix of students and faculty and staff in the assembly itself. But there's also a working group that's a mix of those groups with our Ansazu Lab who are designing together how the
Yeah.
assembly will even work and also what will be the topic of deliberation and kind of all the relevant decisions taking place in the lead up to it. So I think our Ansazu Lab still has a decision-making role, but they're only like one part of the whole committee, which is mostly made up of the people from the institution and some of the students and so on as well. So I think that's also pretty cool.
Yeah, I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think we need more of that, and I look forward to hearing what you learn because I'm sure, we could
Yeah.
also go too far and the whole thing falls apart because it's not structured enough. I do worry about that. So
Mm.
it cannot be a free for all that takes
But I
forever.
think we need to
But
try new things as
we
well,
need to
though.
try and take a
Yeah,
risk, absolutely.
totally.
And for me, it became apparent when I was myself on the governance committee of the French Convention on End of
Mm.
Life because I felt like it was just people like me meeting on Zoom and making all these decisions. And the more we went through the process, the more I was like, who are we to decide this? Like, it's just like obvious. And in fact, it became so obvious that
Mm.
even the 15 of us, we ended up organizing a lot of votes in plenaries for decisions we couldn't take anyway. Like, for
Yeah,
example,
interesting.
who's going to speak to Macron? Why is it the 15 of us deciding that? It cannot be. So we had them choose in a plenary not only who they were going to choose, but how they were going to choose them. So they had first to decide: do you go with an liquid democracy model, like electionless,
Mm.
candidate-less
Mhm.
elections, or do you go with a random selection? And they had this back and forth about the merits of the various procedures. And interestingly, to speak to the nation, they wanted to select people who spoke well and were like the good students of the convention. So they
Okay.
chose liquid democracy and they identified 7 really well-spoken people
Okay.
who were the ones who wrote the little thing that spoke to the nation and was filmed. When it came time to choose the representatives, the 2 representatives to speak to Macron, you could only have 2 because it was a very short amount of time allotted for their speech. They went back and forth, back and forth. Some said, we have to find someone who's really like at the level of Macron. And then people said, no, on the contrary, he has to come down to our level. And after all, this assembly has been designed on the basis of random selection. So let's continue with that. So they chose the two representatives, one female, one male, on the basis of lot, and I thought this was the best way to go. Like it was much better that they made this decision than us.
Right.
So that was
Yeah.
the lesson I took
Well, they
from
have an
them.
ownership of it after too.
Yes, and I think they made better decisions than we would have made. The other thing that confirmed that deep intuition I got from being on that governance committee is with my postdocs we did a special issue on and a conference on that you were at actually on if
Oh
you
yeah.
remember, governance of citizens assemblies.
I
Remember?
remember.
And we had these
Of course.
four former members of the Citizens Convention on End of Life participate and write a little note about how they experienced the governance of that assembly. And they were mostly critical, actually. And in particular, one of them said something which really stayed with me. He said, Leo, I forget his last name, Vander something. I can share the name later. Anyway, it's now in the public domain. We published this notes on in the Journal of Sortition. So it's available if people are interested. And so his testimony was to say, look, we had so little control over the proceedings, the agenda, the choice of experts. We were not invited to any of the governance meetings where these decisions were made, that we never really learned how to govern ourselves or exercise power ourselves. So when given the choice between letting the facilitators write up the report or doing it ourselves, what did we choose? We chose to let the facilitators do it. And it's not because we thought we were not capable of it. It's because we didn't trust each other. We were sort of equally powerless. We preferred to be equally powerless than to try and take the chance of failing, by, making the wrong choices and everything. And I thought, yeah, well, so we don't want in this movement for citizens' assemblies to replicate the mistakes of electoral democracy, which is that you never trust enough, right? You let people choose the elites, but you don't let them actually exercise power. And I worry that the trend right now is to be very comfortable with the current model, where we gather them, we micromanage them, we facilitate them to death. And at the end, we are just keeping them in this infantile state of like, yes, they get to say stuff, but the way it's conducted, the way it's aggregated, the way it's all controlled by others outside of the assembly. So
I think those are really, really interesting reflections. And actually, one of the things that I wanted to get to as well is that I felt in reading this book and also the conversations that we've had, that being on that governance committee also really had an impact on you, and like also the nature of both like your research agenda, but I think how you view these assemblies. And actually, I remember even because I had read one of the earlier drafts and we had a little feedback session after that conference
yes,
that you were just talking about.
which was
And
amazing, by the way. I'm
like
so much grateful.
it was very fun. I think Lex might have brought some Calvados along at the end of it as
Yes,
well.
it helped.
But we did the session sober, just to be clear to those listening. But like the title, your even former title of the book had the word love in it. And
The
actually, I
former
think the
title of
word
the book
love,
had love in it? What? No, I don't think
yeah,
so.
I think so. I can't remember what it was
That?
exactly, but it did.
Okay.
At one point, one of the titles, possible titles, had it. And you write about love and like this idea of civic love, and you tell all these really moving stories in there. And I think that really also came from your experience of being part of this, which I also think, like in general, there's a really big difference between the academics who have been involved in some capacity directly versus the ones who never ever even observed an assembly and are doing theoretical work on the sidelines. So that's a separate point, but a big plus one to you for, I think, having gotten into all of this. But I can also see how that changed, because in a lot of the earlier work, there's a bigger emphasis on the benefits of deliberation when it comes to like collective reasoning and the benefits of cognitive diversity for having better decisions. And not that any of those things are no longer true, but actually I sense like a profound realization of this other element, which makes
Yes.
these processes so transformative, and it's the impact that it has on people. So, anyways, I'm talking too much. Like, I would love for you to say more about this.
Well, you just summarized it brilliantly. I do think it sort of transformed me in a quite profound way. So I came at it from a very theoretical, abstract, hyper-rationalist perspective, which, is also the product of being educated in elite institutions, in like, I would almost say like very masculinist assumptions about how a philosopher reasons and what they reason about. So I would say emotions and all of that was not on my radar at all. In fact, I kind of suppressed them. I would say I would just bracket, focus on like the analytically tractable. And then when I went to the first Citizens Convention as a pure observer, this one on climate, the shock of it was really the human dimension and the love, really. It was not a question on my mind how to call it because it was so obvious, right? And I remember thinking, I went to the first meeting. I couldn't go to the second one because I was teaching, but I went to the third one. So the difference between the first meeting where everybody was cautious and little timid and scared and unsure and skeptical, and the third meeting where everybody was like hugging, slapping each other on the back, joking, and having all these like tender gestures and declarations of love. As in the book I reported in chapter 7, which I think is the best chapter, because it's the most humane in a way. They use that vocabulary. They said we have a passionate connection. There's Omar in the book who talks to Francois, and Francois says, Omar, I fell in love with him on day one. These are not this is not the vocabulary of tepid, respect or even friendship. It's truly love. And another one at the end said, we've become like a family born out of the works of chance and necessity. I mean, they grew lyrical about this. And I felt it. I felt another guy that I interviewed in the book as well, that I mentioned in the book. I call him Jules in the book. In the book, he says, I feel loved. I feel like basically they feel embraced for exactly who they are, and it gives them wings. It gives them a sense of their potential, a sense of their dignity. So I don't know. I didn't even think politics like that was possible. And I think a lot of people are skeptical, rightly so, when they hear me, because I myself initially had some qualms about speaking in that register because you sound like you've been brainwashed or enrolled in a sect or something, but it's not. It's truly a special sort of setup where people, lower their barriers, lower their guards, get to know each other, get to respect each other despite deep differences of value, age, ideology, and all of that. And once you touch that, you're like, why is this such a microscopic part of politics? Why don't we scale it up massively? It would do so much good to the fabric of society, and to not completely lose track of the collective intelligence argument. I think, in fact, what I've concluded is that you will only get the epistemic benefits, like all the collective intelligence, if you trigger the love part first, because it's the bond that opens up people's minds and hearts and make them capable of generating all that, collective wisdom.
Yeah, totally. Well, there is some research actually on this. I'm forgetting the name of the authors of this paper, but we can include it in the resources we share along with the different things you've mentioned too. But there is a paper around what gets called in academia group building and the benefits of this being like the most important factor for people's ability to grapple with the complexity of the topic they're going to talk about. And it has to do with precisely what you're saying. They actually come to trust one another and feel, I don't know, I guess maybe even vulnerable and able to ask what might feel like stupid questions or things that they wouldn't dare to ask. Or like, being really also willing to share very personal stories in relation to what they're talking about as well. And I think the skepticism maybe comes from the fact that when you go to witness politics as we know it today, it's like nothing like what you're just talking about. So it's hard for people to imagine, like, how is that even possible? I think that's one part of it.
No, and I remember also some really moving moments, again, during the first climate convention one of the most beautiful debates was about should we consider the possibility of like a 28-hour week? It was more like the left-wing side of the assembly, which thought like, well, if we're trying to fight greenhouse gas emissions, maybe we want a slower economy,
Mm.
and then you had the people on the other side who were like, well, it's not realistic, it's not, we need growth, but usually in a classic political setups, this conversation goes awry very quickly. Like it's invectives. It's like you communists versus you capitalists, and nobody listens, and it's crude
Mm.
and caricatural. And this time it was truly respectful, deep, like going really deep into the pros and cons, with people
Mm.
clearly open to changing their mind, clearly open to the possibility of being wrong, not putting all their identity into um, being right, just truly
Mm.
respectful and curious.
Mm.
And
Mm.
that I'd never seen anywhere except philosophy seminars, basically.
Indeed. But I think part of it, at least though, I don't know, I don't know if you would agree with this, but for me, I think part of it is because you're bringing people into this space where they are not there to also try to represent or defend a party or their business or their sector or like a group that's meant to represent their like identity of their gender or anything. Like it's really
Yeah,
like
yeah,
they're just all there as humans who happen to
exactly.
all live in the same place and they're there to like collectively figure out how do we want to live together around this issue. And I think that just makes such a difference to other kinds of settings where that like extra layer of an identity lens makes people just more closed to deviate from the position of that group.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm. Mm. And oh, I have so many other questions for you on this. I guess, yeah, I mean, for me, this is part of what makes me feel hopeful. And I think the more people get a chance to be experiencing these assemblies, but even getting to go and like witness them or observe them, like I'm yet to meet someone who does that and does not come away also changed by their perception of of their
Have
fellow
you
humans.
Have you watched the documentary by Adam Cronkite?
I have not actually.
I really highly recommend it.
Okay.
I think it's the first one that truly captures this emotional
Okay.
dimension, the vulnerability. And actually, it's not a perfect assembly. It's a group of people. It's about 30 people, so it's kind of
Mm.
small-ish. Brought together, not even in person. It's all virtual on Zoom during
Okay.
COVID in Michigan to deliberate about COVID restrictions. And somehow he did such a good job. So it's called Goodbye Elections, Hello Democracy. So,
Okay. We'll also put a link
pretty
to
clear.
this.
And it's really like beautiful. Like there's this conversation between a woman who lost her husband and needs help with, with her children and like cannot face
Mm.
the situation alone. And then this other guy on the other hand who has two children too, and he's a libertarian and says, look, I chose not to have many children, not to be a burden on society. So, it gets very
Mm.
tense. It gets very tense. And I'm not going to spoil the movie, but you see how this kind of deliberation can actually heal tensions like
Mm.
that. And it's just really moving.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. I've heard some wonderful things. I'm definitely going to check it out. But actually, you mentioning the fact that it took place all on Zoom also brings me to another question that I wanted to kind of explore that builds a bit on what we were just talking about too, because I think at the moment people, us included, and many others, but in different ways, exploring this question of how could you scale this?
Yeah.
Because like there's that human transformative element. There's also like this is a better, more inclusive, but also, more trustworthy and other elements of making a better decision process. So how do we have that happening for more decisions or involving more people? And there are many different positions on this. And I think for me, all of the work that you described and what you were just saying also on this kind of love dimension and how people connect with one another and the importance of that, like I feel like the further away you go from things being in person and synchronous together to things that get called deliberation but are taking place online asynchronously with text-based exchanges that sometimes one can even question whether they're actually even deliberative, like the further you're getting away from any of the benefits that you just described. And there's like a conflation of what people are talking about when they say like scaling deliberation. Some people are saying we need more of these in-person assemblies just on more issues because we have no shortage of issues on which we can do them. And others are like, let's try to get 1 million people onto a text-based platform where they're just like sharing opinions with
Yeah.
one another. So it's like a huge spectrum. And where do you
Where do I situate
and
myself?
actually, can I just add one more thing? Because there's on a different part of the spectrum, given AI and AI agents and all of the latest developments in that direction, there's also people who are like, well, we could train an agent on one's preferences, and those agents can deliberate with one another to try to reach some form of consensus. And that to me feels like the furthest move away from what one can even call deliberation, and all of the benefits of what you're just describing now being just like totally absent from anybody's experience of what it means to deliberate with other humans. So yeah, some provocations. I know you've
Yeah.
written things on this.
So it's going to sound like a cop out, but I think we should explore all of these options because I genuinely think we don't know. And I've said I would say that I've moved a bit myself. I think I'm more in favor of I mean, or I think I'm more optimistic about the potential of Zoom-based assemblies because of, for example, the Michigan Assembly. Obviously, the same psychological mechanism can work if
Mhm.
it's done well enough. So I would say if the question is okay, um, all in person or all on Zoom or somewhere in the middle, obviously for the Connecticut Assembly, we chose to do mostly in person. We're
Mhm.
doing 4 in person, 2 virtual. But, the reality is that it's always trade-offs, right? Like, it's costly for us to pay for hotels and in-person
Mhm.
presence and it's costly for people to drive an hour to get to us, find
Mhm.
parking, when they could be home. That's a reality. So the
Mhm.
question is so if you want, I think that it's good to maintain a little bit of in person, especially at the beginning. I think it makes it more real. It gets people to
Mhm.
bond in a more animalistic way, like you see people in all their dimensions, not just as this box on the screen. But I have to say, the power of imagination in humans is so enormous that once you've met people and you've
Mhm.
created that ignited that bond, I think it can be sustained and even deepened through purely virtual meetings. How far, how long? I think we don't know. So maybe you do one in person and then 4 virtual, and then you redo one in person to reignite. Like it's like a little fire. Like
Mhm.
you've ignited it, but like how long can it sustain itself without some air?
Mhm.
But I think it could be that we were capable of stretching it quite far. And I
Mhm.
think we have to believe that if we think we can have a world democracy, like a global sort of way of relating to each other, because it would be enormously costly to have, you know, I mean, at the level of the planet, like it's not compatible with, climate considerations. You'd have to take
Yeah,
people away
totally. I
from.
mean, I think on that front, I actually mostly agree with you as well. I think there's another inclusion dimension that if it's a genuinely democratic process, though, like I'm curious what your plans are in terms of the people who don't have a computer at home or who have never used Zoom or all of these things, because COVID gave us that natural experiment. And
Yeah.
I remember being involved in a few assemblies where, like, in one of them, there were 10 people who had never used a computer and like had to come to the library. There was support for each of them. So there's also sometimes an assumption it's kind of cheaper or easier, but not everyone has the luxury like we do all the time to be using these technologies, right?
Yeah. No, so we do plan on helping people and providing tech support and to people who
Mm.
don't have access to that. The one thing we decided not to do, but like it's a limitation of our design, not design, but like also resources. We cannot do hybrid, so we're going to do either or. It just sounds like really a
Yeah.
nightmare to try to combine. I think hybrid is great, but you have to do it right, and I just don't know that we can do it right now. But it's too bad because there's this woman who received the letter, and she said she would love to join, but she cannot, for medical reasons, go to in-person meetings, and so it's very complicated for her. But I just don't think so.
Mm.
Inclusion, it's an endless, it's a goal that's unreachable, full inclusion, but we're trying.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But I think there's different, like, again, it's on a spectrum of how much is done. But so, okay, but I think what, like, even some in person, some on Zoom, it still
Yeah.
to me falls on one end of a spectrum. Like, where do you stand on, like, I don't know, the use of the text-based
Yeah. Yeah. So
platforms?
that
And
one,
are those
again,
actually deliberative? Is that a form of opinion mapping, which one could argue it is?
yeah, so I have to say the mass online deliberation. So I wrote a paper some time ago now about like
Mhm,
whether AI can bring deliberation to the masses. And there's this one model where you give everybody access to this kind of virtual room about a key issue, and you let people basically join the way they want, asynchronously, on different parts of the conversation. And to me, I have to say, I have a hard time calling that deliberation, because
mhm,
to me, it's more like a wisdom of crowds type of uh,
mhm,
process where we're like bees, and some bees do
mhm,
this, some bees do that, and there's a queen bee in the middle who's doing more, and sure, it's generative of collective intelligence and very useful, but I see it more as an aggregative mechanism rather than
mhm,
a true deliberation. For me, deliberation has to be a lot more structured and
mhm.
involve everyone almost equally in terms of the exposure to arguments and the response. So for me, the ideal of deliberation is much closer to the example I just gave you of people in this plenary in the Convention on Climate who were deliberating the pros and cons of the 28-hour week versus a classic sort of full work
Mhm,
week, and the
mhm,
kinds of economies that this would correspond to, the kind of social justice this would correspond to, the kind of family life this could correspond to, because everybody was like listening to this ping pong of arguments and could join in. And whereas if it's just millions of people on a police platform putting a
mhm,
little thumbs up on one sub key argument to another key argument, it's too fragmented. I think it's great. I
mhm.
think it's needed, but I don't know that I would lump it under the category of deliberation, if you want. Now, there's a question
Mm.
you asked, which is very intriguing to me. You said, could we delegate some of those tasks to an agentic AI?
Ah, yeah.
And I think I'm curious, honestly. I think we should try it just to see how far you can disaggregate the task of deliberation. Because right now we talk about deliberation as one thing, but it's multiple components. There's the listening part, the processing part, the generating argument parts, and
Mhm,
I don't know, maybe some of these modules, these components can be outsourced to an agent who's very faithful to actually how we think, what we think, and help us get closer and faster to the core of deliberation, which we may not have yet quite identified. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I also, of course, I'm fully convinced that you cannot outsource it entirely because you will lose the democratic muscle, like you will lose
mm,
the capacity to even understand what's going on and make it yours. So that the minute you lose that, then it's blind deference to
mm,
an AI, and I don't think anybody would be in favor of that. I would say it also depends on the nature of the conversation and the purpose of deliberation.
mhm,
So, for example, on abortion, on end of life, I mean, that's where I would privilege in person as much as possible,
mm,
not agentic AI involved, etc. Now, part of my work now is about how do we expand the use of citizens' assemblies to the world of shareholder democracy. So, I have this work with
mhm,
Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales on how to create so-called investor assemblies that would allow shareholders to have their views, including their pro-social views, not just materialistic views,
mm,
profit-obsessed views, represented properly at the level where decisions are made in the corporation or in the industry level or in the investment fund. And honestly, I think there, given everybody's time constraints, it could be much more on Zoom. It could be mediated by agentic AIs. I think I would have less concerns about that because the upside is that you'd still get a more representative system. But I think you really want to lower the barriers to entry there. And if you demand in-person participation, extremely intensive months and months of participation on okay, how are we going to not allocate the money, but like what guidelines are we going to design for, investments that are respectful of animals' rights and, you know, climate considerations and all of that. I think there we cannot be too taxing of people's time and cognitive abilities. So I could see there a use for more intensive AI, more AI intensive procedures, more mediated meetings, etc.
But
So
okay,
basically,
well,
it depends on context.
can I
Yeah,
pick up on some, because I think, well, you've made a few things that I want to come
yeah.
back to now. Because, well, one is I'm not fully sure that I understand the logic for the kind of shareholder context and so on. Because I mean, depending on what kinds of financial institutions you're talking about, like I know there's been a number of pension funds that are doing this. There's a bank in Belgium that's doing an assembly. I don't know if there's other economic institutions more broadly that are interested, but like pension funds, for example, they're managing millions, sometimes billions, massive portfolios. These are huge investments and they're big players. And that actually the kinds of decisions they're taking are sometimes way more consequential than some of the things people are deliberating on in certain citizens' assemblies as well. There's also the same level of complexity around some of those issues and the need for learning too. So maybe just to understand, like, why do you have a sense that in that context, maybe actually having in person or as intensive deliberation feels less important?
Well, maybe you're right. Maybe we should switch the mental priorities, and that indeed these investment funds have so much more power than states now. That in some ways that's where our investment, our energy should go. I guess it's based on my own automatic reaction. I got some like mail from L'Oreal where I apparently have some stock that my father gave me at some point. I don't know. And then there's this like form that looks incomprehensible. And then there's no way I'm going to invest. Like there's just no way I'm going to
Okay.
invest time
Okay.
in an on.
Okay.
So I guess I mean, unless the
Hmm.
cultural shift happens where I really myself fully
Yeah.
understand that this is
I
even
think
more
it depends on the
critical.
country as well, because in some places pension funds are way more important and impactful
Yeah.
than in
And I
other
guess also I
places
would
as
say
well.
pension
So
funds are
there's a
a
context
bit
thing.
different, I would say, than
Yeah.
even investment funds because investment funds, like let's face it, like who puts money in there? It's the top 10% of the income distribution
Right.
again.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah. Yeah.
whereas pension
Yeah.
funds is everybody. So actually on pension funds, I would say it's even more important. And you might want to make it a big deal and in-person meetings. Just
Yeah.
that
Well, and
like
it's
right
also
now.
different because, like, well, at least like now I'm in the Netherlands, so I'm more familiar with this system. So just to take it as one example, like in most cases, people they don't even have a choice of the pension fund. It's like set up through their sector
Yeah,
on a sector
yeah,
by sector level, and
exactly.
everyone's
So
part of it. And it is one of these like still collective societal things in a way. So
no, especially for pension funds, as you say, there's no exit. You're forced to put your money
yeah.
there. At least in stocks, you don't, you can exit
Mm,
in theory. So,
mm,
but maybe it's a larger conversation about, okay, what are the economic conditions for us to have the time to invest in all these things? Because it's time
mm.
consuming, right? And right now, the sort of system in which we live makes our time so rare and so precious
Mm.
that and in fact, every time I bring up citizens' assemblies as a form of jury duty, people are like, "Oh, Hélène, no one wants to go to jury duty. It's too time consuming, and why would you want to give us more work?" Yeah, but
Mm.
it's super important. You don't realize that not investing that
Mm.
time is coming at great cost to your life, and the
Yeah.
ramifications are enormous. But we've created a system where we've made time for politics and time for civic endeavors so rare that
Yeah.
we're burying ourselves even more by not engaging, and it's a vicious
Yeah.
cycle,
Well,
basically.
I guess we're living in a moment too where there is also this feeling of total separation between like us as citizens and the government. So we also like now back to the context of in general, if we're
Yeah.
thinking about political institutions, there's this sense of like, well, like citizens are being asked, what do you think of the government? How much trust do you have in it? And vice versa. But actually, like in ancient Athenian times, for instance, like that question wouldn't have even made sense because everyone was the government in some way or other. People were just taking turns taking decisions in different institutions. Now, of course, it was by no means a perfect democracy, and that was still limited to only a certain part of the population, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to go down the rabbit hole of
Yeah.
talking about that. But in terms of the principle and premise, like what would that mean if we came to such a shift that there was not this
Well,
dividing line between
yeah.
government and citizens? Like we are all citizens and we are all government in a way.
Well, and not to indeed do the endless caveats about ancient Greece, but the fact is that their free time depended heavily on slave labor. But the thing is that technically
For
AI
sure.
is promising us that freedom, right? Like if AI,
Mm.
robots, and automation takes away all that time we're spending in economic activities, then why is it not an opportunity to free it for political activities, right? But that's a
Yeah, and
conversation
for
we
the
never
ones that
had.
also like we need our cognitive functions for, because I think part of what I'm worried about in some of these like conversations that are going on about where could or should we use AI in deliberative processes, sometimes there is this argument of like the need for speed because they do take time and they're so long, but it's also like it's partly because they take time and there is some friction involved that makes them even like valuable and useful in the first
Yeah.
place. Like we had a meeting with like the Deliberation and Technology Network that we're coordinating, and one of the practitioners was sharing, like someone asked them, do you have a hard line of when do you never use AI? And she thought for a moment and she said, yeah, actually, there's one activity that we would just never use it. And it's at this moment when people have initially gone through talking about all sorts of different ideas, and then they go to a stage of like clustering those ideas into different things. And you would think that maybe like, oh, but AI would be really good at that and it would do it really fast. And then people would have all the categories. But actually, it's like that whole process of doing that work, like people actually come to really understand the meaning of them. There's like whole extra discussions that go through like getting to like clarification of what did we actually mean by it. And there's a sense of ownership of what came out of it. And the like wider discussion, like people brought in kind of reflections of like other moments when they've tried to use AI in a deliberative setting. There's just like this sudden like lackluster sense of like the energy dissipating from the room of people like no longer feeling like they're the ones actually doing the work that's involved in it. And I just think that yes, you could use it for certain things and make things faster, but like
Yeah.
I think we need
No,
to keep the critical reflection of like what are we losing and why are we even doing this in the first place
yeah.
in all of
So
this too.
I completely agree, and it goes back to your point about what it does to you to watch these things in person as opposed to theoretically, conceptualizing them from
Mm,
afar, from your armchair. So I used to think, before I really went, or even when I first went to the climate convention, I was thinking, oh my God, it's taking forever to start. Like the first three sessions were really like going in circles a lot and a lot of PowerPoints, and I was thinking, why don't they deliberate? Well, so I think part of it was justified in the sense that I think the French have this very sort of top-down approach where they have to have a million speeches by the organizers before they get started. But the other dimension, I realized that no, this time is not completely wasted. They're getting to know each other. They're
mm,
getting to trust each other. So, back to that, like there's a time where if you go to AI to just, yeah, but you can, if you have the conversation before they trust each other, it's not going to be productive. So you need to waste time building that trust
mm,
through kind of pointless conversations that go in circle. Fine.
mm.
And I have to say, again, it's part of this ideology we're swimming in unaware. It's all about efficiency. So I was recently at a think tank in Washington discussing the potential of AI for democracy. And one of the questions was like, well, we know democracy is inefficient. So isn't the potential of AI to make it more efficient? And luckily, the group was like really taken aback and very critical of the very premise because we were like, well, is it inefficient or is it just exercising our democratic muscles in the conversation in doing exactly what you described, which is like
Mm.
figuring out exactly the parameters of the conversation, and if you try to short circuit that too much, you don't build the trust, you don't build the
Mm.
muscle, and you're just like, it's not going to lead to the kind of outcome you think it will.
Yeah, indeed. It makes me think the David Krakauer, who's the executive director of the Santa Fe Institute, has this really nice comparison of complementary and competitive cognitive artifacts, and how technologies can be one or the other. So things like, for example, when you're trying to learn math, the abacus is a complementary kind of tool that helps you strengthen your skills, that when you take it away, you're much better at math without it. Whereas the calculator is a competitive tool that you're great when you have it in your hand, and you take it away and you haven't learned any math. And I think the same thing applies here when you want people to ultimately become better deliberators and strengthen those skills. You can use AI in ways that is helping people do that deliberation better, which is why I'm excited about certain tools like DemBrain and Cortico and others. But on the other hand, you could see how introducing certain things that appear efficient and make things faster and smoother are actually like totally defeating the point and weakening people's capacities and skills to take those with them into all other areas of their lives.
So that said, just to give a counterexample, because again, I think we need to experiment more to be 100% sure of where exactly the boundaries of these uses are. Andrew Konya, he did this thing with Ramesh in Paris, bringing together groups of Palestinian peace activists, Israeli peace activists for, I think it was a weekend or a few days. And it was a few years ago, and unfortunately, there's not that much academic reporting on what happened. So, I have oral testimonies and all of that. I don't know how reliable they are, but basically the idea was that when they brought them the first day, before they had used Ramesh as a sort of consensus, I mean, as a way to identify points of consensus, it was very tense and the conversation went nowhere. The second day, after everybody had independently used Ramesh to the algorithm was able to phrase certain proposals in a way that attracted consensus on both sides. They started from that, and apparently the conversation went much better and did generate the sort of emotional connection that was absent the first day. So in that case, I don't know. I would need to see exactly what happened and how the tool was used to fully understand. But it looks as if not only did the tool save time, but it also spared participants very negative emotions and a sense of like frustration. So that sounds like a little bit the opposite of what we're saying. But again, I don't know because I haven't looked at I don't know how it exactly worked out. So I just feel like there's so much we don't know and so much experimentation with different tools that need to happen. Yeah.
Well, that I agree with, and I think we need also the research that goes along with the examples of like the things that
Yeah.
we're talking about now as well. I'm not familiar enough to be able to comment on that, but it does make me think of another tool I came across just last week or something, developed by a Japanese researcher called I think Shutaro Aoyama, if I'm not mistaken. But we'll also include the link of an AI tool that's meant to, as a pre-deliberation tool, that people spend about 10 minutes with it trying to
Oh,
surface what their values are before they go into the deliberation process, which helps them to articulate better why they kind of have these underlying values related to so they haven't yet also done any learning, so there's still a need for other expertise and so on. But I think some pre-work to help you understand better and articulate better when you come into the room. It doesn't tell you what you think, or it doesn't start with any consensus amongst anyone. It's on an individual basis. But I think
yeah,
things like that
makes
at
sense.
least are in a similar direction of what you're
Yeah,
referring to.
it's like a little deliberative warm-up or something like athletes before they
That's a nice
run.
phrase.
You have to, I could see, that is useful.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I am going to wrap us up because I realize I've been a terrible timekeeper. The conversation has just been
well, it was fun.
so interesting. So thank you, Ellen, for taking the time today for joining us on Democracy Next.
Claudia.
Another democratic future is possible. So I would definitely encourage everybody to read Politics Without Politicians. We'll share a link to that, but also a link to some of the various papers and things that we've talked about during this conversation on our newsletter and our Spotify page. So if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out Democracy Next podcast channel on Spotify. And you can also find free resources, including our assembly guide and research papers at demnext.org. So thank you again, Hélène Landemore. You remind us that indeed another democratic future is possible.